Alrighty, how are we doing seventh grade? Today we're going to do a short lecture on the continuing on the Renaissance. And in your math, or not math, but your morning email that you received today, there was a list of things that I wanted to cover today. We were supposed to cover in a lecture in class, and I was going to record it so that you could then watch it later if you needed to review or whatever else, or to complete your notes. What I'm going to be looking for you to do today is I'm going to look for you to complete those notes. I'm going to kind of fill in the blanks orally here, and you're going to write it down, and then you'll have that information available to you when it's time to take the test, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we're going to cover a couple of things today. I know it's not very exciting just sitting here watching me talk. I don't expect anybody else to watch this other than my students. So this is going to be low on entertainment value, but this is how it is at school anyway. You sit there and I talk. Not the most exciting thing. All right, what we're going to talk about first is we're going to talk about humanism. What was it? Okay, what was humanism? Okay, humanism, in short, was the idea that the individual and people are, but particularly the individual is really important. It was a focus on the human being, the human experience, on the individual person. Okay? I think, therefore I am. That is a very humanistic idea. This focus on the individual and just human beings in general. Humanism, the focus here is on reason, it's on logic, and it encourages people to develop their full capabilities. Now, this all sounds probably pretty normal to you, like, okay, yeah, what's special about that? That's just kind of like, isn't that the way everybody thinks? It wasn't how everybody thought for many years. This was a new way of thinking about what it meant to be human. Up until the Renaissance, the focus had really been on religious things, things of faith, things of God. And there wasn't really a whole lot of emphasis on human achievement, on what people did and what individual people did. It was all about, God and the Bible and religious themes. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on individual human beings. A lot of the ideas of humanism were based on Greek and Roman ideas, and as we already learned, the Renaissance was a time where there was a renewed interest in the Greeks and the Romans, so it kind of made sense as far as that goes. So again, the focus is a focus on human achievement, individual human beings, and a focus on reason, not just religious faith. So those are the key points you want to understand about what humanism is. Okay? Now, yesterday, or in the last lecture, I mentioned that the Italians, where the Renaissance really began, were really interested in the work of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Today I want to address how did they come into contact with the ancient Greek and Roman ideas and so on and so forth. Well, part of it, you have to realize during the Middle Ages, most Europeans didn't really know much about what the Greeks and the Romans had done, or what they thought, or so on and so forth. Okay, but during something called the Crusades, when a lot of Christians were going to war in the Middle East, trying to get control of Jerusalem and so on and so forth, they had a lot of encounters with Muslims, and the Muslims were able to introduce them to the writings of the classic Greek philosophers and Greek thinkers, and the Romans as well. They still had access to them. They hadn't gone through this Dark Age period, so they had a lot of knowledge and learning. And that was one of the ways in which Europeans started to learn about the ideas of the Greeks and Romans. Another thing was, of course, the Italians, as I mentioned yesterday, lived right where the Romans used to live. This was where Rome was once located. So they had access to the ancient buildings and the statues that were all around them. And they started studying those ancient works and trying to kind of create similar things themselves. Okay? So that's how the Italians came into contact with the ancient Greeks and Romans. One, through the Crusades, interacting with your Muslim people who knew about the Greek and Roman ideas, and then, of course, their exposure to the works of the Greeks and Romans just by living there and seeing the things that have been left behind. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is accomplishments in literature, and I want to talk about three names that were particularly important. One is Dante. Dante was an Italian writer from Florence. He was a poet, and he's most famous for a book called The Divine Comedy. I wouldn't say a book, it's more like a poem called The Divine Comedy. And it was written in what was called the vernacular. The vernacular, okay? And I'm going to actually show you that word in a very low-tech kind of way because I think it's good for you to know it. Since you guys may not have access to a textbook, it's going to be good for you to see this. I'll make sure it's neat. You can pause the video and write that down. The second one's a little bit neater, vernacular. And vernacular is basically the language that people speak, the ordinary language that people spoke. Again, this is something that to you is going to sound ordinary. What other kind of language would you write in other than the vernacular? Well, in the Middle Ages, those few people who could write typically wrote in Latin, which was not a language that most people spoke. But that was the language of the educated people. It was the language of that things were written in. So you didn't see things written in your own language. You would see things written in Latin, including the Bible. It was not written in the languages that people spoke. Those languages are called the vernacular. And one of the things that happened in the Renaissance, which is again a very humanistic idea, is that they stopped writing everything in the language of the Bible. They started writing it in the language of the people that they could actually understand. And Dante's poem, The Divine Comedy, was one of them. It doesn't sound very funny. It's the story of a person's journey from hell to heaven, and it describes some of the punishments for different types of sins that people commit. So it doesn't sound very hilarious, but that's the title of it, The Divine Comedy by Dante. And I'm going to give you the spelling of his name as well. As I'm realizing you guys may not be able to see that. I'm going to hold that up. You can pause that video and write it down. D-A-N-T-E, Dante. Okay. The next person we're going to talk about is somebody named Chaucer. He was an English writer. He also wrote in the vernacular as well. And in high school, you will probably read some of his Canterbury Tales. That's one of the famous pieces that he wrote. And basically, the Canterbury Tales was by Chaucer was a collection of short stories about different people who were on a religious journey to the town of Canterbury. Canterbury is actually where was kind of the headquarters for the Christian church in England. So they were all making the trip there, and as they're going along, they're each telling their story. And what made the Canterbury Tales stand out is that he didn't just tell the stories of the rich and the powerful people who were on the trip, but also those who were poor, those kind of ordinary citizens at the bottom of the rung, so to speak. One of the things that's really interesting is that the English that we speak today comes from the form of English that Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales and his other works in. So it's from, that's kind of one of the first pieces of writing that's written in the English that we speak today. So it's kind of a big deal. That's Chaucer, and that's the Canterbury Tales. Last person we want to talk about is a guy by the name of Gutenberg. Very important person as well. Gutenberg. And Gutenberg was a printer from Germany. We've got his name right there. You can pause the video if you need to write it down. Gutenberg. Okay. Gutenberg was a German printer, and he developed a printing press. Now, the Chinese already had printing presses for a while, but because their language has so many different characters, it wasn't very practical. But with the European languages, which had fewer letters, so to speak, in their alphabet, fewer characters, it was much easier to work with. And so he developed a printing press. I cannot stress to you how important this printing press was both to the Renaissance and to just kind of a lot of things. It's actually going to be a really big deal when we start talking about the Reformation next as well. But this invention, basically what it did is it made books available to people. So you have books starting to be written in the vernacular, which means it's a language they can understand, and then you have it easy to make those books. So you have to remember, before the printing press, how were books written? Literally by hand. They were written by hand, and it took a long time. Bibles, you couldn't just go out and just grab a Bible. I mean, you know how big the Bible is, and every Bible that existed had been written by hand, okay? Copied by hand. So it was a kind of a big deal to have this printing press, which meant that you could now start to make multiple copies of a book and people could have access to it. So this was a huge revolution. People's learning. You guys think about how much would not be possible if it weren't for the printing press. It's kind of a big deal. So that was what Gutenberg invented. And the very first European book printed was, guess what? The Bible. That's right. The very first book printed was on the Gutenberg press was the Gutenberg Bible, and it does still exist. At least one of the copies does. I'm not sure where it is, but I know that you can see it in a museum somewhere. The very first book that was printed on Gutenberg's printing press. Okay, here's what we want to talk about as far as impact of humanism. This is we live in just a sea of humanism. Humanism is just the way our culture is, and we're so used to it. I'm saying things that are kind of obvious, right? Individual people, you matter, you're important, you have great talents, you should use those talents. That's humanism. People didn't always think that way. People didn't think that before humanism came along that the individual really mattered that much. It's really just whatever God decides, that's what happens, but you know, you don't really matter. But this concept of the individual achievement, of individual talent, that's humanism. That's a big impact right there. You have this focus on reason and logic and science. Every time you say, that doesn't make sense, that's a humanistic thing to say, right? A focus on science, math, medicine, astronomy. Okay, those are three big things that are all tied into the study of human achievement. Okay. Leonardo da Vinci was a true man of the Renaissance. I just noticed in my notes I misspelled his name. I put Leonardo da Vinci. Should be Da Vinci with an I instead of an E on the end there. You can change that in your notes right now. Leonardo da Vinci. And he was a true Renaissance man. And what do we mean by Renaissance man? Today, when we talk about Renaissance man or Renaissance woman or Renaissance person, we're talking about somebody who is good at a lot of different things. They're not good at just one thing. I can think of one person I know, my professor, one of my mentors in college, a gentleman by the name of Dr. LaBianca. And he, to me, is a Renaissance man. He's good at a lot of different things. He's an archaeologist, he's an anthropologist, he's interested in religious faith, he's interested in the environment, he's also a musician, he plays in the orchestra. He does a lot of different things, and anytime you have somebody who's good at a lot of different things, different areas, we call that person a Renaissance person. And Leonardo da Vinci was definitely one of those people. He was a scientist. He used to cut open dead bodies to learn more about the human body. He studied fossils to understand the Earth's early history. He was also an inventor and an engineer. Most of what we know about Leonardo da Vinci we know from his notebooks. He left down lots of sketches and drawings of all kinds of things, including flying machines, parachutes, other things that he hadn't even invented, but he had ideas for. He was definitely a picture of what the humanism was all about and what the Renaissance was all about. Now we're going to move on. We're going to talk a little bit about changes to art during the Renaissance. A couple of things changed in the way that people painted during the Renaissance. And one of those was that during the Renaissance, the focus really began to be on trying to make people look lifelike, to look like they really looked in real life. So they wanted to paint people that looked authentic. You think about the drawings on the walls of the tombs of Egypt, right? Or even if you were to look at paintings from the Middle Ages and stuff, the emphasis wasn't necessarily in making them look like real people. It's not that those people didn't know how per se or couldn't learn how. It's just it wasn't important to them that they look like real human beings. But it was important to the Renaissance artists. They wanted people to look realistic. Okay, and so that was one of the things that we saw happening with them. They also tried to reveal how people felt. They wanted their expressions on their face, the way their body stood, to communicate their emotions and their feelings. So that was really important as well. They also came up with the concept of perspective, and this is a way of showing people and things as they appear at different distances. It's the whole concept of, and I know Mr. Scott has talked a little bit about this in your art class, of making something that is far away look smaller than something that is closer. That creates what's called perspective. Right? You guys have all seen pictures of people. Oh, I'm squeezing your head. I'm squeezing. Look, my hand. It's squeezed. It's as big as my. It's like you know what I'm talking about. All right. So that's the concept of perspective. They also studied the human body carefully to try to draw it accurately. They began to experiment with light and color and shade. They also used something called chiaroscuro. I should have figured out how to pronounce this before I started this video. But it's in your notes there. Chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro is basically using light and shadows instead of solid lines to show to outline objects, and it just made things look more realistic, more lifelike. And then last of all, we talk about frescoes. Frescoes were basically a type of painting that the Italians and Italian Renaissance painters in particular like to use, which was a way of painting on wet plaster. And the plaster would be wet, and they'd paint it with watercolors, and it would dry, and you would have it. You have famous paintings like the Sistine Chapel. Those were frescoes. Wet plaster, you put the watercolors on while it's wet, and then it dries, and you have your painting. So those were frescoes. So, some leading artists of the Renaissance. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. Do those sound familiar to you at all? Ever heard those names before? Maybe from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? There's one more. I think it's Donatello, who is also actually an Italian Renaissance artist. But all three of these guys, they named the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles over four of the main artists of the Renaissance. So you have Leonardo da Vinci, we talked about already. Very famous for the Mona Lisa, probably one of the most famous paintings in the world. You have, he also painted something else called the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples, very well known. Michelangelo was a famous painter and sculptor. He's most famous for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. If you've ever seen a picture of God creating Adam and so on and so forth, that is Michelangelo. Also did some really famous sculptures. And then you have Raphael, who also painted a lot of frescoes and things. One of his most famous paintings was called The School of Athens. And then you have Donatello, who I'm not going to talk about right now, but he was another famous Renaissance artist. And then last of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the Northern Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance is basically the Renaissance spread from Italy into the rest of Europe, kind of like how the coronavirus spread from Italy to the rest of Europe, except this was a good thing, okay? The Renaissance spread from Italy into Northern Europe, and by Northern Europe we refer to Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, that area. And so a lot of Northern artists started copying some of the techniques. They used some different mediums. The Northern artists were particularly responsible for using oil paintings, which allowed them to go into great detail. And one of the cool things about oil paintings is that you can paint over things. You can actually, when the paint is dry, you can actually paint right over it, which is something you couldn't do with frescoes, which allowed them to create a great deal of detail. So oil paintings were a key feature of the Northern Renaissance. And then we also have William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, you've heard of him. I'm sure you've heard of him. One of the greatest writers of the English language. Huge impact on our world. He literally made up words that we still use today. A lot of famous phrases come from him. And the thing about Shakespeare is that he wrote about people's strengths, their weaknesses, their emotions. He wrote all kinds of plays. He wrote comedies, he wrote tragedies, he wrote histories. He wrote about plays from history of England and Rome. He also wrote plays that were set in Italy, such as Romeo and Juliet, which was set in the Italian town of Verona. Definitely one of the most famous writers ever, and someone that you should know. All right, that brings us to the end. Hopefully, if you've been going along with me, you've been able to complete your notes on the Renaissance, and this video will hopefully prove useful to you as you prepare for your test. Thanks for watching.